Tormented Souls aims to recreate the long-lost essence and idiosyncrasies of PlayStation 1 and 2 horror games by bringing back features that are now all but obsolete. Does it successfully capture what the internet loves to call them good old days of true survival horror? Or is it like getting back together with an ex from 1,000 years ago and barely 15 minutes into that coffee date you start to remember that maybe, just maybe, things didn't work out for a reason? Well, time to find out. By now you've noticed that the title for this video describes Tormented Souls as classical horror, not classic survival horror. There's a good reason for that, and it's because the words classic and classical are often used interchangeably, but also incorrectly. These two words do not mean the same thing. The word classic describes something that is typical. In other instances, it also describes something that is definitive. The word classical, on the other hand, refers to something that is traditional and has long been established. Contemporary survival horror games do not play by the same rules and limitations the genre faced in its infancy back in the 90s and early 2000s, rendering the old-school titles and their quirky characteristics as neither definitive nor typical. That ship has sailed long ago. In the same vein, Tormented Souls is not a classic survival horror game, it's a classical horror game, and a fascinating one at that. Before we start though, if you enjoy the content, like the video, subscribe, ring the bell, and enjoy the ride. One fine day, Caroline Walker is sitting at her dressing table, breathing in the morning sun. The doorbell rings to her surprise. A mysterious photo of a pair of twins arrives in her mailbox. There's writing on the back. Caroline gets a sharp headache, almost as if the picture was calling to her. With no hesitation and no real motivation other than the "gotta do it 'cause it's a video game" cliché, Caroline enters the Wild Burger Hospital and proceeds to the first door on the left. Then she gets bonked on the head with a crowbar, wakes up in a bathtub sometime later, followed by the revelation that she's had one of her eyes removed. That's quite a lot to digest within just a few seconds. I guess this place really is a wild burger after all. This is where the game starts, right after Caroline gets dressed up. And right off the bat, you can switch to the alternative costume that's in the locker right in front of her. It's a neat little addition to the game because as iconic as the main outfit is, it's also kinda nonsensical. This bathroom scene is an homage to Capcom's Haunting Ground, but it feels like this game kinda misses the whole point of that game's intro because, unlike Fiona, who had no choice but to wear the perverse outfit she's been given, Caroline actually shows up at the hospital dressed up like this. This is what she was wearing at her house, and she decided it was appropriate for a hospital visit. After choosing the outfit of your liking, you set out into the dark and somewhat dilapidated corridors of the hospital. If, like me, you can't get enough of the iconic Spencer Mansion from the Resident Evil Gamecube Remake, then you are in for a treat with this game. The Wild Burger Hospital is the most successful attempt at capturing the same magic, that same Stockholm Syndrome effect of the Spencer Mansion. Being a small indie game, the Wild Burger Hospital setting is obviously not as polished, but it's got tricks up its sleeves to be so much more than just a lesser imitation. If you don't have much experience playing horror games, you probably won't pick up on just how many elements from many different games Tormented Souls borrows to make something of its own. The setting alone is responsible for blending at least 3 of the most iconic horror game settings wrapped into one. The game is set in a mansion that has been converted into a hospital. Here's why this is a brilliantly amalgamated setting. First off, you can clearly tell that the architecture is that of an old mansion, which is basically the same idea as the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil 1. Then the hospital equipment that's thrown about all over the place is actually derived from the Alchemilla and Brookhaven Hospital from Silent Hill. As a consequence of putting these two ideas together, the result is a refurbished building that is inspired by Resident Evil 2. This is because Resident Evil 2's RPD setting used to be an art museum but was then converted into a police station. By the same token, the Wild Burger Hospital is a former mansion that's now been converted into a hospital. Think about just how ambitious and complicated this must have been. These are 3 separate ideas, every single one of them used to be a whole game on its own, each with their own separate aesthetic and visual language, and somehow these small teams over at Dual Effect and Abstract Digital found a way to combine all 3 within just a single game, in a compelling way. This blending of ideas does not stop at just the setting. There's more, lots more. Expect some spoilers from here on out. Tormented Souls wears many popular horror tropes on its eclectic sleeve. You've got the exploitative narcissist who misleads their devout religious followers, a popular trope inspired by Silent Hill 1, which that in and of itself is inspired by Stephen King's The Mist. You've got a mystery surrounding a pair of twins that hooks you into the premise, and a horribly bloated and disgusting apparition wanders around the place. All of this is also from Stephen King, but this time it's from Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. Then you've got an ancient supernatural ritual that brings back people from the dead, which is heavily inspired by voodoo zombie folklore, something that I also talk about in my Resident Evil 4 review, as it's one of the few survival horror games that actually dabbles with the voodoo zombie idea. Somehow, even time travel plays an important role in the grand scheme of things. And last but not least, you've also got twisted experiments done on hospital patients. The official website says they are dementia patients who were abandoned by their relatives. Of all the stuff that is in this game, this is the one that really got under my skin. It's hard to feel indifferent about this game's enemies if you know what it's like seeing a loved one slowly slip away because of this illness. But I respect the developer for not shying away from something this dark and twisted. I treat horror like I treat dark humor. If it hits where it hurts, then it's probably doing something right. Tormented Souls does a lot of great things with its ideas, but its biggest accomplishment as an homage is its restoration of fixed camera angles. The fixed angles used to be a workaround for technical limitations, nothing more, nothing less. The most bizarre thing about this omniscient third-person perspective is just how much of a unique personality it brings to the table, despite the sheer impracticality. From a survival horror standpoint, this perspective holds the genre back, as it gets in the way of movement and flow of combat that is essential to the genre. From a solely pure horror standpoint, though, it's pretty effective. The limitations incentivize avoiding combat, and simultaneously, the omniscient view works really well at observing the environment holistically when engaging in puzzle solving. And Tormented Souls has lots of it. The weird part is that even though Tormented Souls is centered around puzzles, a sizable portion of the game consists of confrontational moments. The combat is as clunky and janky as it was 20 years ago, but unlike most classical horror games of that time, in Tormented Souls you are clearly meant to engage in combat. There's no doubt speedrunners have nailed down some sort of unorthodox dodging strategy to an exact science, but for the average player like you and me, it's easy to tell that it wasn't the intended experience. Enemies are usually as wide as the corridors themselves, leaving you little else choice but to fight. You do have a dodge button you can use to bait enemies into attacking, but it's best used to get the upper hand in fights. If you're thinking about using this just to run past everything, then you're in for a wake-up call. Given the classical nature of this game, it is no surprise that Tormented Souls features tank controls. But what is surprising is that the tank controls feel inferior and floatier than the 2D controls. This is unusual given that tank controls are inherently better at maintaining a flow of movement in relation to the camera, making them ideal for running past enemies, among other things. But in Tormented Souls, running past enemies should be the last thing you ever do. As with most survival horror games, Tormented Souls emphasizes the illusion of limited resources, but actually gives you enough to deal with everything if you play efficiently. There's a stalker enemy that spawns in the second half of the game that is exempt to this rule. The purpose of a stalker enemy differs from game to game. Some games pivot entirely around them to a point where confrontation is inevitable. Usually it's a scripted fight, and occasionally the player is given smaller scenarios to get the upper hand in exchange for optional rewards, but more often than not, they are merely obstacles put in the way to stifle the rate at which you explore your environment. And Tormented Souls' stalker role is built around the latter model. That being said, if you dislike the idea of having a stalker in your horror game, you can easily circumvent this problem by simply exiting through a door and then re-entering, and the ghost should despawn every time. Whether or not this trick was intentional or merely an oversight, it's good to know that it's there. Since the puzzles can get so elaborate, backtracking becomes a necessity. Pairing that with the abundance of ammo, clearing out rooms full of enemies is an absolute no-brainer. In fact, the game punishes you if you prioritize conservation of ammo over conservation of health items. Caroline can die just after a couple of hits, and healing items are incredibly scarce, whereas ammo is not. That's not to say that you shouldn't try to conserve any of your ammo at the early stages. I recommend using the nail gun on enemies until they fall to the ground, then open the menu, reload the nail gun from there, and switch to the crowbar. 2 hits should be enough. You're saving anywhere from 1 to 3 bullets with this simple strategy early on, but little by little these savings add up in the long term. This way you'll have enough ammo to get rid of every enemy from start to finish. Despite the huge emphasis on confronting enemies and deriving satisfaction from pulling it off without a hitch, the combat is a pretty bland system and by no means the focal point. Moving on to inventory, this is an interesting one. It doesn't work exactly like in Resident Evil and it doesn't work exactly like in Silent Hill, but instead mixes and matches different elements from both to create a unique hybrid. The blending of these two particular franchises specifically is a recurring theme in every single aspect of this game's design, as I'm sure you've noticed. I really like Tormented Souls' take on this system. It's not perfect, but it's got good stuff going on. It uses Resident Evil's layout design, but the actual system has no carrying limit, just like in Silent Hill. It also neatly divides everything into 3 categories: items, resources, and files. The abundance of items can make these menus feel overwhelming even with the separate compartments, and unfortunately you do have to use it a lot to swap weapons. But overall it's a really responsive and snappy system, and it keeps the time-wasting shenanigans to a minimum, making the item management feel, well, manageable. The map is just as much of a hybrid system, but one cool thing that it does is that it takes cues from the Resident Evil remakes, meaning that Tormented Souls uses color coding to make maps a lot easier to parse. However, it's important to note that the color coding works quite differently here. Usually in Resident Evil games, red rooms indicate there are items left to pick up, and green rooms indicate you've grabbed all the items. Tormented Souls gives these exact same colors completely different meanings. Red is used to indicate rooms, while green is used to indicate the structures in between that connect the rooms together, such as corridors and even the central hub that is the main hall. While it is true that it would have been nice to see which rooms you may have glossed over, this system has its own benefits. The green and red contrast gives these different sections of the map a sense of place, orientation, and an easier way to memorize all the different rooms in relation to the corridors they are connected to. The map only tells you in which room you are in, but it doesn't specify where in that room you actually are. This might sound like a tedious system, but it's actually well balanced. The lack of knowing where Caroline is in any specific room encourages you to engage with the mansion's layout and hone your muscle memory. This is where the green and red contrast on the map comes to good use, as it both figuratively and literally helps you to read the room. It takes a little while getting used to at first, but the trade-off works well. It's important to note that Tormented Souls does not include adjustable difficulty options, whether it's for combat or puzzles. The puzzles are hard, genuinely well thought out, and they do not hold your hand. You should expect them to occupy about 80 to 85% of your total playtime. If you're not interested in sifting through plenty of notes trying to figure out all the clues and piecing together the story in order to progress, then you might want to look elsewhere. Personally, I'm not much of a fan of in-game reading. I like to keep that as a separate hobby, but Tormented Souls plays out this trope in a really smart way. This is because the lore is actually tied to the puzzles themselves. This means that if you're someone like me with ADHD who just picks up a note and can immediately feel their brain cells leaving one by one because none of the text is relevant to the moment-to-moment gameplay, this gives you a legitimate reason to actually care about the history and world building that's being conveyed through text. Tormented Souls has some of the best puzzles I've seen in a long time, possibly ever. They can be incredibly cryptic, but they aren't tainted by the same pseudo-intellectual pitfalls that some old-school horror games used to fall victim to. I don't consider myself as a blunt tool in the shed, nor do I feel inexperienced when it comes to horror games in general, and yet Tormented Souls' puzzles genuinely made me feel stupid. And I mean that as a compliment. The first puzzle that I'd say was really abstract happens on the second floor of the West Wing. If you've played the game, you definitely know what I'm talking about. The solution to this one caught me off guard as it required doing something that pertains to character movement instead of solving a tangible puzzle. My mistake was that I was searching everywhere for the latter, but never stopped to consider the former. Admittedly, this puzzle left a bad impression at first, as I was half expecting to roll my eyes more and more with every new ridiculous puzzle solution, and this impression kind of lingered for a while. That impression changed about halfway through the game, when I encountered a puzzle labeled the Monkey Thief. This one consists of 2 parts, the physical puzzle and the note that helps you solve it. It's a familiar puzzle about the 3 wise monkeys that live with the motto of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. But with a fascinating twist. The best description I can attribute to this puzzle without giving it away is that it's like a magic trick hiding in plain sight. Theatrical magic is about the art of misdirection, using multiple points of interest to distract your eyes towards or away from what the magician wants you to notice. Like a magic trick, the Monkey Thief puzzle contains more than just one point of interest, but it does it in such a subtle way that even though I felt frustrated by the correct answer at first, the revelation of a small little detail hidden in plain sight not only left me speechless, it recontextualized the whole piece in an indescribably satisfying way. This was the moment everything clicked, and I began to understand just how intelligent these puzzles actually were. I felt humbled and enlightened. I'm not saying that understanding the brilliance of Tormented Souls' puzzle design will make much of a difference when it comes to replay value, but there's a good chance you might walk away with a great sense of accomplishment and respect for the team that developed the game. That was definitely my experience, so take that as you will. If I had to describe the look and feel of Tormented Souls using only 2 words, it would be spectacularly cluttered. Tormented Souls is a graphically unremarkable game that is elevated by stunning environmental design and art direction. If you're expecting cutting-edge graphics, you won't find it here. All it takes is one glance at Caroline's plastic-looking character model to realize that Tormented Souls has little to do with graphical fidelity and everything to do with style, lighting, and atmosphere. The majority of the game's presentational bells and whistles clearly went into the Wild Burger Hospital. The obsessive amount of detail put into every corner of every room brings this decrepit place to life. When classical horror games fizzled out in the mid-2000s, fans of the genre were left to their imagination, longing for the day that 3D graphics could ever capture the same picturesque beauty of the pre-rendered backgrounds. For almost 20 years, the Resident Evil Gamecube Remake stood at the top of that food chain. Relatively recent games like Until Dawn and Song of Horror have pushed the envelope since then. However, Tormented Souls might just be the first title to actually surpass the remake's level of detail. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single camera angle that doesn't have something visually interesting going on. Walls are meticulously detailed, characterized by ornate designs and supporting anything from notice boards, candle sconces, light fixtures, taxidermy mounts, classical paintings, detailed old photographs, mounted televisions, air conditioners, ceiling fans, and even caution signs. Being a mansion that's been turned into a hospital, you can paint an utmost vivid picture of how each room functioned in both scenarios just by the clutter alone. Safety railings can be seen everywhere you go. Long benches occupy wide open spaces and rows of chairs depict long, ominous corridors having once upon a time functioned as calm, monotonous waiting rooms. Gurneys are recklessly scattered all over the place, and wherever you set foot, there's an assortment of statues, dressers, hazard precautions, plants, antique items, and a million other objects. The environmental storytelling in this game is simply off the charts. The developers found a way to marry function with form, the blandness of hospitals with the theatricality of luxury. These two aesthetics on paper couldn't be any more different. However, in execution, both styles were somehow unified, complementing one another in a way that doesn't come across as nonsensical. Compared to other, way more ludicrous things that are in this game, the aesthetic and world design are arguably the two elements that are the most grounded in reality. If you've ever visited a doctor whose house doubles as a polyclinic and you've also been in an antiquated hospital with severely outdated equipment, it's not a stretch to think that a full-fledged mansion doubling as a hospital would look shockingly similar to the Wild Burger. Well, of course, minus the patient monsters and creepy basements, I hope. When it comes to horror, regardless of the medium, lighting is key. More specifically, it is low-key. And while yes, that is a terrible pun, that's also the name of the lighting technique that is the most prominent within the genre. It entails characteristics such as really dark and dramatic shadows that are juxtaposed with very limited sources of light to create a strong contrast, drawing attention to specific points of interest within the blocking of a scene. This contrast also has a psychological effect on the player, as the warmth of the lighting provides the illusion of comfort within an otherwise brooding and chilling atmosphere. In the case of this game, the source of light and the illusion of comfort comes from Caroline's lighter. You ever played Resident Evil Code Veronica and wondered how awesome it would have been if the backgrounds had the same dark and macabre feel as the Spencer Mansion when you walked around with a lighter in hand? If the answer is yes, well, say no more. Tormented Souls gives you exactly that. Walking around dimly lit hallways with the lighter was the best part of Code Veronica, and it's even better here. This right here is why Tormented Souls deserves more attention in the industry. Not because of some stupid lighter, but because of how it affects the character's entire world around them. How it elevates so many different elements such as atmosphere, immersion, and even gameplay all at once. This is a real and tangible slice of the untapped potential of fixed camera angles, and whether or not we get to see the industry see the value in them might very well depend on how successful this game turns out. Tormented Souls uses a mix of static and dynamic camera angles, and while the camera work isn't always top-notch, it puts a great deal of effort in depicting the world in a flattering way. Static angles offer a wide field of view on grandiose environments, while dynamic angles make the lesser ones feel more remarkable through movement, gracefully ascending, descending, and tilting to give the illusion of a presence looming over Caroline every step of the way. From meticulous panning to overhead shots to Dutch angles, the camera shots find a balance between feeling artistic and compelling, even if at the expense of pragmatism when it comes to combat. That being said, the cameras do a great job at feeling seamless, and the angles tend to switch in a natural flow more often than not. Animation quality is a bit mixed. Caroline's walking and running animations are conventionally slow, but feel smooth and fluid enough. When it comes to combat, weapon recoil and melee swinging feels somewhat undercooked, although the dodge animation is relatively superb. The enemies swing and attack with the same stiffness as Caroline, however in their case it seems to work in favor of their stunning yet horrific character designs. The enemies themselves look generic, but what sets them apart are the medical attachments they are connected to, and how the apparatus dictates what type of enemy they are and what movesets and attack patterns they possess. Facial expressions is where the animations go downhill, ranging from comically expressive to downright unresponsive and full of lip-syncing issues. While it does detract from the sense of immersion and storytelling, it's not as big of a deal as it sounds, and it makes sense that this small studio would focus more on the world itself rather than its run-of-the-mill characters. Besides, the real gist of the story is actually found within the files and notes you pick up along the way, and they are rendered in immaculate detail. Interestingly, files such as newspapers are printed in English, however diary entries are rendered as handwriting in Spanish, which are then prompted with an on-screen English translation. Given that both Dual Effect and Abstract Digital are a couple of small studios based in Chile, the Spanish handwriting makes the game feel more authentic. Not only do I hope that sentiment will resonate with more players, but that it will also leave a ripple effect on other aspiring developers from all around the world. Items and weapons are just as beautifully rendered. In terms of functionality, the weapons fall under the usual archetypes of shotguns, handguns, and blunt objects. However, in terms of form factor, the weapons you obtain have a homemade MacGyver feel to them. The weak starting pistol is a nail gun connected to an air pressure tank. The shotgun is literally just a bike's brake handle and a staple gun handle attached to a series of connected pipes. It's a total abomination, but I quite like the design and creativity that's on display. The electric lance is a late-game weapon with a similar form factor to the shotgun, but is riddled with enough electrical components to pass off as Nikola Tesla's idea for a cattle prod on steroids. The post-launch update for the game added a significantly improved nail gun. You can unlock it by solving one of the more abstract puzzles right at the very start, but the game only gives you the clues to the puzzle upon completion. It obviously was meant to be a reward for New Game Plus. That being said, this is the PS4 version that came out half a year after the PS5 original release, so I knew about the secret nail gun in my first playthrough and I just went for it. I wouldn't say it trivialized my experience by any means. It is more powerful than the standard nail gun, and it being able to fire 3 nails in rapid succession can certainly make situations a bit more convenient. However, the trade-off is you're wasting more bullets. Here's the thing, if you're unfamiliar with these games, you're probably not scrounging up enough ammo, so you'd be screwed either way. And if you're relatively more experienced with classical horror like I am, you're never going to run out of ammo regardless of which nail gun you choose. It makes no difference in difficulty one way or the other. All it does is save some of the tedium. And if all else fails, your last resort is a crowbar. No outlandish design, no fancy attachments, just a good old-fashioned steel bar to Gordon Freeman the shit out of everything. It's somewhat ironic how as I was writing the script, Gordon Freeman came to mind as I was mentioning the crowbar. The silent protagonist trope is supposedly used to facilitate the player projecting themselves onto the character so that one can quote-unquote empathize and care for the journey. But you're not really empathizing if you're not willing to walk in another character's shoes unless it's your own personality superimposed on a character devoid of one. The way I see it, a silent protagonist can only enhance the storytelling in one of 3 ways. A. The game uses minimal storytelling and it wants you to fill in the gaps as to what could be going through the protagonist's mind yourself. B. The protagonist is not as important as the world and the other characters they surround themselves with. C. The game's voice acting is so bad that it unironically benefits from a protagonist who's better off saying nothing at all. Unfortunately, Tormented Souls is option C, and could have greatly benefited from not just a silent protagonist, but perhaps no spoken dialogue altogether.
What? Is this My room? Father, what's going on here? Why is that weird man walking around the operating table with that weird chandelier in his hands?
What are you talking about, child? I don't see anything.
Please, miss. You have to help me get out of here.
Of course I'll help. Stay calm, okay? Everything will be all right. I promise.
The voice direction is obviously designed to emulate the awkward acting of old-school horror games. It's intentionally bad. Whether this is a point in favor of or against the game is up to you. There is a charm within the awkwardness of the delivery, and those who grew up playing PlayStation 1 horror games are probably going to enjoy the nostalgia. I say probably because despite having nostalgia of my own, I don't glorify it. Whether it's intentionally bad or not, it's still bad. That being said, the underlying issue isn't necessarily the voice acting itself, it's more so that the game missed the opportunity to raise the bar in terms of acting quality to prove that there is still room for this dormant niche to not only have a full-on resurgence, but to grow and give contemporary horror games a run for their money. By default, the fixed camera angles already limit what you can do with gameplay, therefore you need to compensate in other aspects to keep the player interested. If you can't have a strong gameplay loop, then you need a strong motivator, which is usually the story. Speaking of strong motivators, Tormented Souls doesn't really have one. Everything you set out to do is fueled either by curiosity or nostalgia. You could end up enjoying Tormented Souls' story for what it's worth, especially if you pay attention to the notes like I did, but the game doesn't really do enough for you to actually care. Caroline talks a lot, but she never has anything to say. She strikes up plenty of conversations with the only other two fully voiced characters, the local priest and a girl named Anna. But none of the dialogue ever feels natural. Every sentence feels too formal, serving as exposition dumps instead of actual conversations. The banter also lacks any sort of chemistry. The lines felt like they were separately recorded instead of listening to actors playing off of one another in a studio. This issue of heavy-handed exposition is not exclusive to the dialogue. It persists in the diaries and notes you find as well. These are unequivocally the most interesting parts of the story, but none of the characters that jot down these notes have a writing style of their own. They don't have a voice, so to speak. The Wildberger family members, including Anna, the little girl that was mentioned just a moment ago, have documented their life story over the years, but you never get a sense of who's whom just by observing the prose. The writing is compelling to read, especially considering this had to go through the trouble of localization and translating all of it into English. It's pretty good. And that's part of the problem, actually. Anna's diaries don't read like a child's writing at all. It's too well written for her age to feel believable. It's the same sophisticated, curated, perhaps even flowery writing style of all the other adults who either worked or resided in the hospital. And I'm going somewhere with this. I'm not just criticizing a small studio's efforts just for the sake of it. If I had to give some constructive criticism, it would be that the game would have probably benefited from discarding the recorded dialogue. If it focused on writing a tighter script across the board, from diary entries to notes to even just resorting to text prompts to serve as simple dialogue, I'm convinced the game could have done more with less. So how do other diegetic sounds fare in comparison? Well, let's start with the usual one, footsteps. Starting off with Caroline, the sound effects of her boots sound pleasant in isolation, but it doesn't always holistically come together. The footsteps themselves have enough subtle changes from the weight of one foot to the other, but surfaces that Caroline walks on aren't varied enough to prevent the soundscape from feeling repetitive. I've also encountered a couple of sound mixing issues that are more prominent in the late game. The first one is that the volume isn't properly balanced when switching from one camera angle to the next. You could be walking along a particular type of surface and suddenly the camera cuts to a different angle and the sound goes from loud to whisper quiet, and vice versa. The transition isn't as seamless as the game's is trying to emulate. You're not supposed to notice a drastic shift unless the game intentionally wants you to for dramatic effect. This is clearly not the case for Tormented Souls, given the second sound mixing issue, and that is the fact that some surfaces in the late game are straight up missing the sound effects. It could be that the studio ran out of budget, or time, or both. That being said, the PS4 port of Tormented Souls did receive a handful of patches since release, and from what I can tell, they seem to have made the game run and look worse over time. Whether these missing sound effects were always present or not, I can't say for sure, but it would be nice if the developers had these issues patched up in the near future, should the game keep getting support. As for the enemy's footsteps, the Tormented Souls, some of their movements aren't even footsteps at all. They come in different variations. Some are bound to wheelchairs, others are horrifically hung up to drip stands and IV bags, others are abnormally large bipedal creatures similar to both the Garador from Resident Evil 4 and the Slayer from The Suffering. But they all have one thing in common. They were all victims of sadistic experiments, and now they wander around the hospital with metallic claws, spikes, and bolts welded to their bodies for whatever reason. The hospital is dead silent, and all you can hear is the sound of metal and agony scraping the corridors. It's almost poetically tragic. The weapons sound as eccentric as they look, but at the same time they do a good job in conveying a sound that you probably would expect from such unconventionally designed weapons. Most of them are powerful enough, and that's exactly how they sound. There's no high-end arsenal here, just a bunch of clumsy DIY tools that could fall apart and backfire the minute you pull that excuse for a trigger. As far as diegetic sound goes, the highlight for me are the puzzle mechanisms and interactable objects. It's the little sounds, most notably the satisfying button clicks on tape recorders and cassette players, twisting around mechanical parts of a revolving key and a gramophone, which if you listen to it closely also tells you which sequence of notes to play for a puzzle piece. The game has some non-diegetic sounds as well. The inventory menu is full of them. The sound cues provide a pleasant feedback that doesn't get old, and the sound of obtaining new items is similar to Silent Hill's, but also different enough to feel new. Additionally, the game also features some jump scares. I despise jump scares like Wesker despises Chris, but Tormented Souls uses them sparingly and efficiently, which I can appreciate. Moving on to the final piece of the non-diegetic puzzle, the music. Let's have a listen. The blending of Silent Hill and Resident Evil characteristics, tropes, concepts, and themes have permeated throughout all of my 4 playthroughs and the entirety of this review. But nowhere is the influence of these two franchises more equally balanced than it is in the soundtrack. In fact, there's so much of both in Tormented Souls' DNA that it's hard to tell which has more influence than the other. It's quite peculiar because musically these two franchises couldn't be any more different. In fact, beyond the fixed cameras and a similar framework for gameplay tropes, the similarities pretty much end there. Resident Evil is mainly a survival horror franchise, and Silent Hill a psychological horror franchise. One is a genre concerned with blending action and horror into one, and the other is about experiencing psychological inner turmoil within a bleak world that makes you question everything. The music in Tormented Souls somehow takes the musical essence of both and creates a fusion that works better than expected. Uneventful puzzle locations convey different moods, ranging from a heightened sense of curiosity to a calm before the storm type of looming dread. The music during confrontational situations also possesses that sort of musical schism where half of it is Resident Evil's frantic empowerment, and the other half is Silent Hill's chaotic anxiety. Nowhere is this fusion more apparent than in Tormented Souls' climactic moment, where the final boss theme is ultimately a creepy marriage between the rapid tempo of Resident Evil 3's Metamorphosis theme and the unsettling descent into madness that is the Silent Hill 4's final showdown theme.
A few moments later.
And to top it all off, it wouldn't be an old-school survival horror game without a beautiful save room theme. Okay, time to wrap up this review. Let's hit it right off the bat with a big question. Is Tormented Souls really a survival horror masterpiece? Well, if you look up the definition of masterpiece, that definition being a work of outstanding artistry, skill, or workmanship, and then use it as a frame of reference for everything that was just said in this review, the answer is obviously no. Tormented Souls is not a masterpiece. Its concepts are conveyed with a great level of intricacy, but they are way too derivative and on the nose to be transformative. And on a technical level, it doesn't compete with almost any of the contemporary games. That being said, Tormented Souls turned out to be an awesome and enjoyable horror game that well exceeded the sum of its unpolished parts. It fumbles the execution in many ways, but it is conceptually rich and curiously fascinating. I don't tend to give games I review a numbered rating as it says nothing meaningful about the game's quality, but what I like to do is put a number on how much I enjoyed my time with the game. From my personal experience, I think it's up there with the Resident Evil Gamecube Remake. I don't think it has the same amount of replayability, but it absolutely deserves a spot on your shelf if you're into that type of experience. Just like the Spencer Mansion, the Wild Burger Hospital is a character in and of itself, and in both games, it is the best character. As far as everything else goes, it seems that for every one thing Tormented Souls falls short of the remake, it surpasses it somewhere else. Resident Evil Remake has strategically placed enemies and smart, frugal combat. Tormented Souls has complex puzzles that ask the player to think harder than any Resident Evil game will ever dare you to. Resident Evil Remake has the most beautifully composed static camera angles and mise-en-scène. Tormented Souls has even more beautiful clutter and environmental storytelling, it's in 3D, and is just as stunning to look at, and the cameras are dynamic, which makes movement and gameplay flow much easier. Resident Evil Remake has more enemy variety. Tormented Souls has better enemy design. Resident Evil Remake has little to no influence from Silent Hill. Tormented Souls has it in spades. And last but not least, and this is the big one, Resident Evil Remake has 12 endings where not a single one of them actually represents what truly happened, whereas Tormented Souls has 3 endings that allow for more time to simmer, and the good ending is far more conclusive. My experience with the game probably sits at an 8 out of 10. I had a fun time. Tormented Souls is a hard game to sell to someone who's never played a classical horror game in their life. Given how dedicated the developers were to recreating the old school feeling and succeeded in many ways, I'm not sure if this game was intended for anyone aside from those who are deeply attached to the niche. However, I don't think you need to be a purist to enjoy this one. If you enjoy horror games of any sort and are tired of the same old cliché hide-and-seek horror games, and you want something that doesn't hold your hand and demands you to solve some of the most well-thought-out puzzles in the genre, consider checking it out. Tormented Souls is not going to revolutionize how you look at old-school survival horror games, but it modernizes and streamlines just enough elements to make it one of the best entry points into classical horror. It might even encourage you to check out the classics that inspired it in the first place. And with that, The Raven draws to a conclusion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.